The Iranian people are denied the basic freedom to access the information that they want. Because of the actions of the Iranian regime, an electronic curtain has fallen around Iran, a barrier that stops the free flow of information and ideas into the country and denies the rest of the world the benefit of interacting with the Iranian people, who have so much to offer.
They told me that, I'm not in a situation to ask them any question, and they said that I should know what shit I have done in my life and in my career, and so I should follow them.
The Iranian government jams satellite signals to shut down television and radio broadcasts. It censors the internet to control what the Iranian people can see and say. The regime monitors computers and cell phones for the sole purpose of protecting its own power.
They tried to terrify the others in the office and myself by showing their guns. Then I felt that they're coming from the government or the intelligence.
The Iranian youth being the voice that says we deserve more. We're a great civilization. We have a capacity that many other countries lack, and we're being held back by the policies of our own regime.
What the young people in Iran, which represent a large majority of the population, want is they want a future. They want to be connected with the outside world.
I had this feeling that I might come back because I thought that I was very careful. I was not a radical writer. I never wanted to be in trouble.
The electronic curtain is the Iranian government's effort to build a curtain of containment, stopping information from getting in or out of Iran. The same way that the Soviet Union had an iron curtain that stopped the flow of thoughts and information coming in or out of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc back during the Cold War.
I tried to make it calm and say, okay, let's go downstairs, I'll come with you and see what's happening. So once I went downstairs, I never went back to my office again. I never went back to my office again. I never went back to my office again.
By and large, what the Iranian people desperately want is they want to be part of the global community. And that the Iranian government has never been able to offer as to what is a bright future ahead for them. In 3-4 hours from the time I was arrested, I was in solitary confinement in Tehran.
The United States will continue to draw attention to the electronic curtain that is cutting the Iranian people off from the world. The Iranian people are the heirs to a great and ancient civilization. Like people everywhere, they have the universal right to think and speak for themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Amir Bagharpour, and thank you for attending this panel discussion on electronic curtain. I think the trailer for the documentary provided a really good description of what the electronic curtain is in relation to Iran. This issue is of particular importance to the Iranian American community. PAAIA Zogby Commission survey of the Iranian American community indicates that almost 2/3 of Iranian Americans communicate with family or loved ones in Iran on a monthly basis. The building of this electronic curtain restricts information and ideas from entering and leaving the country, and the impact that that has on the Iranian people and the Iranian American community is tremendous because it reduces the quality of people's life there. It's a fundamental human rights issue, and it restricts the growth of the Iranian people by limiting those free flow of information. My first question is for Ramin, and it's a broad question. What are the implications for the United States, the Iranian American community, and the people of Iran as the Iranian government takes action to further strengthen the electronic curtain? I know you spent quite a bit of time developing the U.S. policy on the electronic curtain, basically what the United States government is to do in bringing down this curtain. And I know you have quite a bit of experience working on this issue for over 15 years, particularly your last assignment as director of VOA's Persian service. Ramin, can you please expand on this?
Thank you, Amir, and thank you to the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans, and of course the Congress, the Foreign Relations folks here at the House of Representatives who have taken an interest in this issue at this important time in the United States' approach to this challenge of Iran, which has been a challenge now for 30 years. They'll go beyond 30 years. What this means to the United States is the same thing it meant to the United States that there was an Iron Curtain. And there are folks here who are quite young and have never really seen the life that the Soviet people, the Eastern Europeans, were forced to live under those conditions. But the Iranian people are dealing with the same kind of thing. The effort that the Iranian government has gone to use their best technology, to use their most advanced intelligence, to use essentially every bit of their resources to cut off contact between their population and the outside world, as well as contact within the country, essentially means that they don't trust their population to have free thinking. And they have told their people that we will do your thinking for you. In a society like America, where that's so antithetical to everything that people believe in here, the idea is America stands for something, and that's for the ability to express yourself, the ability to have an independent approach, and the ability to communicate with each other. Here we essentially have every possible ability to communicate online, offline, radio, television. Try to imagine if everything that you tried to do to communicate with each other was monitored, whatever you said, whatever you watched, whoever you met with was subject to serious scrutiny by not folks to see if you're engaging in too racy a conversation, but people to actually be concerned that you're getting involved in any kind of discussion that the government might find objectionable. And that government, the Iranian government, has made just about anything objectionable. Real quick, to give you an idea of how comprehensive this thing is, the Iranian government last year passed legislation that any meeting of more than 5 people had to get a license. That means this meeting here, we'd have to have a license. That means if you wanted to meet 4 friends for lunch, you'd have to have a license. And that's a license from the Ministry of Intelligence. So this is an extremely paranoid government that's keeping its people under some pretty tight wraps. So what it means for America as the country that stands most for freedom of expression and freedom of communication and so on is that this is not something that we're comfortable standing by and watching. What it means for Iranian Americans is that Iranian Americans are the community that's most interested in what's going on in Iran. To communicate with people back there is something that they do regularly, as Amir pointed out, and the fact that that communication is scrutinized and limited means that they're cut off. The Iranian government's most anxious communication is what goes on between this community in the United States, the Iranian American community, or for that matter, just about anybody in the United States, and Iran. So they're kind of right in the crosshairs of what the government's views on this issue are. And then finally, what does this mean to Iranians? Is it means that, like you saw, their population is overwhelmingly young. They're not able to communicate, they're not able to associate, they're not able to really have much in the way of fun, and are monitored every step they take. So for the Iranian people, what it means is that they're not able to live with any sense of dignity or freedom or plan out their future. So real quick, what we tried to do with this electronic curtain strategy is open that curtain a little bit and let them communicate with the outside world. And as we go on with the other folks up here, we can talk about what some of those steps were and what we can continue to do to help them communicate with the outside world.
Thank you, Ramin. Thank you for your answer. Ambassador Schneider, you have quite a bit of experience as a diplomat and a scholar, and you've led many initiatives that are aimed at connecting people culturally, particularly through art and media. Thinking back to the Cold War days, what were some of the challenges for breaking through with the Iron Curtain with the Soviet Union, and what can we learn from that experience and how it can apply to the situation in Iran today?
Well, thank you very much, Amir, for inviting me here, and thanks very much to the House of Representatives for giving attention to this really crucial issue. It's an honor to speak before all of you today. I welcome afterwards your question. I want to encourage people standing, feel free to come up here and sit in the front, and those of you who missed the initial race to the sandwiches, feel free to get up and have them. I hate to have someone have to listen to me on an empty stomach. You'll like it better if you have lunch, so please, it won't bother me. Feel free to get up. You know, dictators and repressive regimes always understand that power comes from controlling information and ideas. Sometimes they understand the power of information, truth and news, stories, narratives from films, and personal connections that are now, of course, possible through internet and phone. Sometimes they understand this better than the proponents and protectors of freedom. I'm happy to say that doesn't appear to be true of our Congress, and that is great news. In the words of the former deputy director of the Voice of America, Alan Heil, tyranny abhors new ideas and truth. And that was something that the U.S. government understood very well in the Cold War period. And so we penetrated that iron curtain, which, of course, in those days was quite literally a curtain that prevented human beings from traveling. Also, we penetrated it with newscasts which told the truth about the outside world, and also cultural programs. And again, quoting Alan Heil, these broadcasts marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Party and Soviet ideology. I wanted you to remember those words because they pertain to the current situation with Iran. So what we did during the Cold War was communicate ideas, communicate the actual news, give a vision of another country, another way of living, another lifestyle. It's very important, you think about it, when you're living in a repressive regime that controls everything you say or do. It's so important to be able to know and to imagine another lifestyle. You have to have that inspiration. So it's very important to know what exists outside your contained space. So this happened in terms of news broadcasts, but also cultural programming, also visits of authors and filmmakers. But most important, I think, for communicating these ideas of freedom during the Cold War era were the jazz music broadcasts of Willis Conover. Willis Conover is someone who's barely known in this country. He is a demigod in the countries behind the Soviet bloc. I've shown programs about the impact of jazz in the Soviet Union to my students at Georgetown, programs, for example, led by Dave Brubeck and other great jazz musicians. And then my students, many of them your age of the audience here, look at me blankly and say, how come people our age in the Soviet Union worship these people and we barely know who they are? You know, this is an impact of American culture that is barely recognized here. Willis Conover was the DJ, the broadcaster of nightly jazz programming that went into the Soviet bloc. Let me tell you what he said about jazz. And I quote, "Jazz is a cross between total discipline and anarchy. The musicians agree on tempo, key, and chord structure, but beyond this, everyone is free to express himself. This is jazz, and this is America. It's a musical reflection of the way things happen in America. We're not able to recognize this over here, but people in other countries can feel this element of freedom, and there are many testimonies that that is true. One from a Russian listener who said, "Every night we shut the windows and the doors, turn on Willis Conover, and have 2 hours of freedom." Václav Havel, when he was visiting the United States and happened to be here on a night that President Clinton was honoring jazz. This was in the year 2000, after, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union. And Václav Havel said, jazz kept hopes of freedom alive in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, during the Cold War period. Then, of course, later on in the 70s and 80s, it was rock and roll that conveyed this message. And here I will quote the former Hungarian ambassador to the United States, András Simony, himself quite a talented guitar player. And when he was ambassador here, he formed his own, which was just a few years ago, he formed his own rock band, bipartisan. This was during the Bush presidency. It was called the Coalition of the Willing. And this is what Ambassador Simony said about the impact that on him, he was a teenager, of rock and roll music. He said, rock and roll was the internet of the 60s and early 70s. It was the carrier of the message of freedom. Rock and roll was a decisive element in loosening up communist societies and bringing them closer to a world of freedom. So how does this apply to Iran today? We, of course, live in a very different world today, where there's 24/7 communication, where citizen journalists perform heroic and very important acts, such as bringing to all of us the death of Neda during the 2009 protests and the deaths of others as well. So in this age of open information, of course, the answer is that it is even more important than ever to protect that openness of information. And while the information between Iranian Americans and Americans and Iranians is very important, think about what Ramin just told us. You know, that you have to get a license for 5 people to meet. Well, of course, 25 people can meet on the internet and exchange ideas and support each other. So that's, of course, tremendously threatening to the Iranian government and tremendously important to keep as a fundamental right of Iranian citizens. And of course, just as during the Cold War period, the Soviet governments jammed the broadcasts, that's exactly what the Iranian government is trying to do today. It's trying to build an intranet, basically to contain all of the internet in the country. It's dedicated $1 billion to that. That's how important it is. In the words of Saman Arbabi, who is the co-creator of the program Parasite, the Iranian equivalent of The Daily Show, which is broadcast through Voice of America, Saman says that, in his view, culture is so important that the Iranian leaders, Khamenei, for example, are much more threatened by culture and broadcast than by tanks and guns. And let me just elaborate a little bit on what I just said. I just described to you a program called Parasite, which is the Iranian version of The Daily Show. And that is literally what I mean. That means that people in Iran watch The Daily Show. They're not often they don't watch it on television, they watch it online. And of course, they totally get the skewering of American politics and politicians through humor. That's one of the most important messages that we communicate from this country. Namely, freedom of speech is not just something we talk about here, it's something we do every day. And we publicly criticize our leaders, we publicly criticize their policies, we hold them accountable. That's such an important example for the world. It was during the Cold War period, and it still is today. So the message of dissent that we send is a very important one. But while communication between the United States and the West and Iran is important, even more important is communication among Iranians. 70% of the population is under 30. 5% is over 65. At the moment, that 5% is running the country, but anyone who can count knows that is not a sustainable situation. So it is so important to empower those young people so that they can communicate with each other. And so that's our responsibility, I think, to protect that space. Now, culturally today, there's also incredible material going into Iran. There's recently been 2 stations set up in Dubai, Farsi 1, and another equivalent called Zemza. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it means whisper in Farsi, and it's a channel particularly targeted towards women. These channels have been able to operate because they have nothing political, all cultural. And they dub in Farsi soap operas that are family-friendly. Interestingly, the most popular ones are from Colombia and Korea. But, cultural programming has its own message, and many of these programs have very powerful, for example, female protagonists. And one of the results of this programming, which is now Farsi 1's the most popular channel in Iran, it's watched by 35 million families every night. One of the results has been a spike in the number of women leaving abusive relationships. So there's another kind of empowerment by examples, by stories, by narratives, showing people that you can take control for your own lives. Now that happens first in a family situation, but you know where it goes from there. And, I'd like to suggest that I think we could do more with these cultural ties. Because I want to clarify, Farsi 1 and those channels are not American. They're run by Tolo TV and Mobi Media, which is an Afghan-run company out of Afghanistan that also sends programs into Afghanistan. I think we can do more with these programs because every time there is a recognition in the West of an Iranian cultural figure, that has a huge ripple effect in Iran. And the most salient example was, of course, the awarding of the Oscar for the Best Foreign Film to A Separation by Asghar Farhadi. And here I'd like to call out a little bit American media for continuing to perpetuate this demonization of Iran. The great Nigerian novelist Wole Soyinka said that culture humanizes while politics demonizes. And do you know that the day after Asghar Farhadi received the Oscar, the Politico, as in the journal Politico, headline quoted not his beautiful statement at the Oscar, but quoted the Iranian government's statement that it was some kind of crazy Israeli plot. And way down in the article, they quoted Asghar Farhadi. So we have some responsibility too. And this humanization is a very important part of the support that we can give the Iranian people. I'd like to close by reading Asghar Farhadi's statement to remind you of this other side, the human side of Iran. And this is what he said. At this time, many Iranians all over the world are watching us, and I imagine them to be very happy. They're happy not just because of an important award or a film or filmmaker, because at the time when talk of war, intimidation, and aggression is exchanged between politicians, the name of their country, Iran, is spoken here through her glorious culture, a rich and ancient culture that has been hidden under the heavy dust of politics. I proudly offer this award to the people of my country, a people who respect all cultures and civilizations and despise hostility and resentment. And just to remind you how much repressive governments recognize the power of culture, Iran's other leading filmmaker, Jafar Panahi, is now serving a 6-year prison sentence. This would be the equivalent of putting Robert Redford in prison. He's serving a 6-year prison sentence for producing films against the regime, and he has been forbidden from making films for the next 6 years. So let's empower the Iranian people by keeping their access to ideas and information open.
Thank you, Ambassador Schneider, for really describing the power of culture transcending politics, particularly in the relationship or lack thereof between the government of Iran and the United States. I just wanted to add to something that Ambassador Schneider was saying as far as the culture with the Iranian people. There's a study that has recently come out, and we actually have this study out there. It's not a PAAIA study. It was actually done by a group of Israeli researchers, and it shows the democratic characteristics of Iranian people being much higher than many governments out there that are already democratic. So this is a very fascinating report. Scientific report on those characteristics. So I encourage you to look at this report or pick up a copy outside. And one other thing, if you look at PAAIA's Zogby Commission surveys, when you ask Iranian Americans what type of government they would prefer in Iran, over 2/3, the majority prefer a secular democratic Iran, and about only 4% prefer a reformed Islamic republic. So it's very telling of the distance between the Iranian people, regardless of where they're located around the globe, and the Iranian government. And I think particularly Congress has done a very good job on differentiating between the Iranian government and the values of the Iranian people when it comes to a lot of the legislation. And speaking of the legislation in Congress, my next question is for Jodi Herman, who's on Senator Menendez's staff as a senior policy advisor. Now, Jodi, to get this perspective, I'm going to ask you, there's been a lot of comprehensive legislation related to Iran, particularly with sanctions, human rights, and access to information, which is a fundamental human right. Most recently, there was a bill that passed in the Senate, the Iran Sanctions, Accountability, and Human Rights Act. One particular section of the bill addressed specifically the issue of satellite jamming, and I think this is very pertinent to the conversation today with the electronic curtain. Basically, satellite jamming is a deliberate act by the Iranian government to jam satellite signals and international broadcasts to prevent the Iranian people from receiving outside information. Thanks to the legislation written by Senator Menendez, it's going to become much more difficult for the Iranian government seeking to illegally jam international broadcasts. Can you provide your perspective in regards to the electronic curtain, Senator Menendez's perspective on the issue, and what the United States can do to keep communications open with the Iranian people?
Yes, thank you. So I want to first thank the Ambassador and Ramin for their comments on sort of the importance of culture and information, which is what we're here to talk about today. Those sort of set the foundation for what I want to talk about, which is what Congress can do to ensure that the Iranian people, I don't want to say continue to have access, but perhaps get access, have more access to these important sources, whether they're TV or radio or internet, all of the above. To sort of put this in context of the Iran legislation that's pending before the Congress, I think it's important to note that, well, what you will see publicly is a focus on sanctions, and that is a very, very important element of what the Congress is seeking to do in the context of Iran's nuclear program. Access to information, human rights, access to information, and censorship issues are also have been significant components of past legislation, SASADA, as well as the current legislation. If you look at this legislation that's pending. There's been bills that have passed the House. There was the bill that passed the Senate in May. Three major elements in that bill. One has to do with sanctions on the energy sector. One has to do with sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. But the other major title of that bill pertains to human rights. And the reason for that is that Congress sees, alongside our very significant security issues related to Iran's nuclear program, the importance of reaching out to the Iranian people, to ensuring that they have the tools necessary to get the information that they need so they can understand, they can get the information about what's going on in the world so that they can communicate with us, but also, as you importantly noted, with each other. So in that context, that title of the bill does a variety of things. It will, amongst other things, I'll talk about the satellite thing in a minute, but it also compels the administration to develop a comprehensive internet strategy targeted toward Iran, which I imagine you'll have some role in carrying out, Ramin. But the other thing that it importantly does is address the satellite issue. And the satellite issue is essentially this. The Voice of America has a variety of services. The BBC has Persian TV. Deutsche Welle has programming into Iran. And the Iranian government has, for some amount of time, sought to, and in fact does, jam the signals for those programs. The sort of technical aspect of that is there's what they call both downlink and uplink jamming. Downlink is sort of on the ground where you jam sort of the local signal, but it's much, much more sophisticated than that. The Iranians have invested a significant amount of money in uplink jamming as well, where they literally uplink to the satellite and jam from the satellite down to the earth or to the territory in Iran, the ability of the signal to reach the Iranian people. And there are some ways that broadcasters, and you can probably talk about this, Ramin, have sought to get around that jamming. They can switch satellites. It may take the Iranian government some period of time to find the new parameters so that they can start jamming that signal. And many broadcasters have done that switch between satellite services. But inevitably, the Iranians eventually catch up with them, and you can sort of continue to play this cat and mouse game, but it's not a fix, if you will. So the one thing that we were looking for in this legislation was a way to essentially force companies or force the Iranian government to turn off their jamming. And the way to do that is by looking at the companies that are in fact delivering satellite service to Iran. So as it would work out, the major companies sort of, I don't want to malign them, but the major companies sort of involved in this are in providing services. They provide services both to the Iranian government, to the IRB, to the Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting entity, and also to VOA and BBC and other services. They're serving both sides, if you will. And from their perspective, they're involved in a commercial enterprise, right? They're serving multiple customers who have come to them asking for services. Our perspective is that while we can understand the commercial side of this, that on the one hand, they're serving the Islamic Republic of Iran's broadcasting service, and at the same time, they have another customer that they're serving, and this customer A over here is essentially jamming the services of customer B, which is another one of their satellite providers, another one of their satellite users. One of the ways to get around this would be to, and this is what the legislation essentially does, is it would apply human rights sanctions to satellite service companies. And I think it's important that we note that these are human rights sanctions. These aren't sort of other broad sanctions, but these have been covered in the title of the bill pertaining to human rights and censorship, because the Congress very strongly believes that censorship is and freedom of speech and freedom of access to information is a human rights issue. It would apply sanctions to satellite companies who engage, who facilitate or support frequency manipulation, which is essentially the jamming element, or who fail to prohibit the manipulation by the government of Iran by service providers that also provide services to the government of Iran. it may not be the ideal approach. I think the ideal approach would be that these companies on their own would either A, decide to stop doing business with Iran, or that there would be EU regulations in the case of the companies that reside in the EU, or other regulations that would compel these companies not to do business with the government of Iran. But in the absence of that happening, I think we thought this was sort of the best way forward. And the model that we used in conceiving this was the model that we used for the SWIFT sanctions. So if you follow sort of the Iran sanctions legislation, one of the things that we did in the bill that we marked up in the Senate was to prohibit financial messaging service providers from providing services to designated Iranian banks. What that in fact generated was a response by the EU Council to actually pass regulations that prohibited the provision of financial messaging services to designated banks in Iran. And I think what we're hoping is to provoke a similar action by the EU and other countries to prohibit broadcasters, satellite providers, from providing these much-needed services to the Iranian government, so long as they are also jamming, right? Nobody's suggesting that we all out cut off broadcasting or satellite services into Iran, but so long as the government of Iran is continuing to jam signals from the BBC and VOA and other networks, that we would not allow them to continue to use the satellite services, or they can continue to use them, but then there'll be sanctions imposed on the satellite providers who are providing those services. That legislation is now pending in the Senate. There isn't a similar measure in the House bills, but I would anticipate that as we move into the conference stage of this bill, that ultimately that we will retain this provision in the bill. The only other thing I would say is, the satellite companies, don't have sort of an ideal track record on this. I've met with some of them, and I think that they're willing to engage. But at the same time, as you would sort of expect them to be fighting for their customers whose services are being jammed, what you've in fact seen is them sometimes moving the customers that are being jammed, VOA and BBC, is moving them to less desirable satellite locations in response to the jamming, as opposed to them reaching out to the government of Iran and saying, if you're going to continue to jam the signal of other users of our satellite, then we're not going to provide services to you. And in fact, I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is sort of the reverse, right, where they've been reluctant to do that, presumably because the Iranian government pays better than the VOA. I'm just guessing. I could be wrong. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen is them sometimes moving the services that we'd like to see beginning through to sort of less well-situated satellites. And as a result, they're more likely to be jammed, and satellite, then the services have to move to other satellites and jump around and continue to play sort of this cat and mouse game that we've seen them play with the Iranians over the last number of years. That sort of summarizes what's in the bill. Happy to sort of take questions about sort of the mechanics of it, but I think it really is important to note that this component, the human rights component, the censorship component, is as important of a piece of this bill as the sanctions measures are. Congress is very, very seriously concerned about Iran's efforts to develop nuclear weapons capability, but at the same time, that isn't the only message that should be taken from this bill. The complementary message of human rights and the importance of combating censorship should be read equally in this bill. It comprises an entire title in the bill, and I think it sends the very strong message that the Congress isn't looking to malign the Iranian people, but that they differentiate between the Iranian government and the Iranian people as being very different entities, and we're trying to reach out a hand to the Iranian people while at the same time trying to send a very different message to the government of Iran.
Ramin, you spent quite a bit of time working on this issue of jamming and assuring that information gets received by the Iranian people. So do you want to follow up and comment on anything regarding this issue?
Real quick, I just wanted to note that as we talk about the electronic curtain, the key point is, as Jodi has pointed out, satellite jamming is something that has taken a lot of importance lately because satellites are, and broadcast satellite transmissions are how 86% of Iranians get their information. So satellite transmissions and their jamming is obviously something that is a key part of overcoming this electronic curtain situation. But real quick, just to summarize, it also includes internet blocking and filtering. It includes persecution of online activists. It includes chilling effect on both Iranians inside the country and Iranians outside, and people who want to communicate with Iranians from being able to do so. That's the electronic curtain. The very well-considered and quite, I think, very forward-thinking attitude of the Congress that Jodi has outlined is that if the Iranian government want to participate in the international telecommunications space by engaging in satellite broadcasts, they have 48 satellite channels broadcasting in 13 languages, 4 of them in Arabic, 1 of them in English, 1 in Spanish, a new one. We're not against international broadcasting. I certainly Voice of America, State Department, the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, of course, is not against international telecommunications. The idea is if you're going to take advantage of an international regime, an international telecommunications structure, don't at the very same time violate the norms of that structure. Now, where have we seen this before? There are other things in which the Iranian government has taken advantage of international norms, international freedoms, and then violated the norms of that very structure. In telecommunications, this is what the Congress, again, very, very, I think, thoughtfully is trying to address, is you can't take the benefits of a modern telecommunications structure without having any of the responsibilities or duties of operating within that structure, and that's what this consideration really is having them face consequences when they violate the standards that everybody else operates by. Again, Iran is a severe outlier as far as this practice compared to any other country in the world that you would like to name, and so they are, this isn't singling the Iranian government out because they're just, they think differently. No, they're very much actively on the very, very edge of suppressing their population's ability to even think and taking advantage of it. Meanwhile, there are press TV people in this city right now gathering news. Why? Because this is a free society. Press TV, by the way, is Iran's English language network. This is a free society. People are able to gather news we consider to be fair and open and it's worth discussing. So they benefit from our philosophy of that while doing everything they can to violate that same freedom for their own people. So that's just I wanted to put the whole thing into perspective and then wrap that up so that we can just talk about how I think thoughtful and engaged the Congress is being by taking on this approach.
Thank you. I have another question, and Ramin, this is for you. Jodi, you could follow up if there's something that Ramin maybe doesn't mention, or if you have a different perspective on this. But actually, last week there were reports in the media, it's like all over the television, that 2 Iranians went to two Americans of Iranian descent went to an Apple store to purchase Apple products at a retailer, and they were denied the purchase of the products allegedly because they spoke Farsi. And this brings up an interesting issue. While the Obama administration has issued guidelines for Americans to do business in providing software and services for fostering better access to internet, U.S. trade regulations, they restrict the same or other companies from providing hardware such as computers and mobile phones. Actually, I see Amir Abbas Bakhravar in the audience today with the Confederation of Iranian Students, and one of the things that he's been advocating from the beginning is getting the hardware technology into Iran so that Iranians can communicate amongst each other. What is the reasoning behind this differentiation between software being allowed into the country and not hardware? I'm sure there's a good explanation for it.
I mean, I can just take a real quick response, and I'm going to let you get into the substance, but I think there are real legitimate concerns about the sales of some of these products to the government of Iran and to entities in Iran for whom we don't wish to see have access to this technology. At the same time, as you know, through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, there is a mechanism by which people can apply for a license, and I think Congress's view, or certainly Senator Menendez's view, would be that is an appropriate way to address this issue. Part of what we're doing in this legislation, calling for a comprehensive sort of internet assessment, if you will, plan for Iran, may be to look at how we facilitate the entrance of specific technology get that technology into Iran. But to the extent that some of these items could be dual use means that they may have both commercial as well as military or security applications. Those products would have to continue to go through the Office of Foreign Assets Control at Treasury.
Ramin, do you have anything to add to this?
Not really. I think Jodi covered it very comprehensively. The Department of Treasury, the Department of Commerce, and other parts of the government, again, the United States believes in free trade. The ideal is that you engage in trade and the people that you trade with use the goods for what they're intended for. However, unfortunately, every single good that can be used for a diversion purpose has been done so by the Iranian government. And so there's some caution here. But the key point, and and it's fair of you to bring it up, is that these consequences that the Iranian American community is facing are the direct result of the Iranian government's approach towards taking advantage of things like a free trading regime and diverting what would otherwise be goods used for personal computing services to other purposes. So it's something that the government, the United States government, obviously takes very seriously. But again, when you're dealing with a country that does not balance out its responsibilities vis-a-vis international norms and rules, sometimes you get into these situations where people pay the consequences of that decision making. But these things are all considered carefully, and as Jodi alluded to, folks can apply for licenses to get products and goods into Iran, and they do that through the Office of Foreign Assets Control.
One other thing I'd add to this, there is a provision in this bill that actually requires OFAC to expedite licenses in most of these circumstances, right? So there was some concern in the past about OFAC not moving very quickly on license applications for many of these things, and there is a provision in this bill that would sort of expedite, still can require licensing, but would expedite.
Ambassador Schneider, you wanted to make a comment?
Just to underscore what Ramin said about the fear factor and the way the Iranian government uses the internet to identify and target its critics. So it is also a tracking mechanism so they can find who is writing what, and that often leads to arrests and persecution. So that's all the more reason to create a protected internet so that people can express themselves. And, I mentioned a lot about the importance of jazz in the Cold War era. There is an equivalent today, while jazz is still very popular, but there's a more contemporary equivalent today, which is hip-hop music, which is absolutely thriving in Iran. And what's interesting when you look at the lyrics of Iranian hip-hop artists, such as, for example, Yaz and others, they're very patriotic. They, again, present this vision, this image of what Iran can be and what the Iranian people truly are. Iran, as anyone who studied its culture knows, these are incredibly proud people with very good reason. And so this is another way that the vision of the alternative from today's society is presented. And this is, again, Iranians talking to Iranians. One of the most important things we did during the Cold War was, for example, to translate and to disseminate, also in Russian, the works of the dissident authors. Solzhenitsyn would never have been published without the United States government. So that kind of activity is equally important now, just keeping up the communication and exchange of ideas between Iranians. And I just want to again commend the Congress for recognizing the importance of this exchange of ideas.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time left, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up to Q&A. Are there any questions in the audience?
Jed, good afternoon. My name is Jed Tuttle. My question is directed at Ramin, but it's open to the panel at large, of course. We've talked about allies, and we've talked about providing hardware and some software to Iranians to give them the tools they need. What role does the U.S. State Department have in working with countries that I wouldn't say aren't necessarily our allies, but definitely partners, China and Russia, who between them provide a large amount of the hardware with regard to China, and then software from Russia worldwide in the modern global age. They are two of the largest providers of internet hardware and content. What role does the State Department have in coordinating with them to make sure that the Iranian people, they don't need kits, they don't need directions, they just need tools to, in my opinion, achieve the goal that the majority of them want, right? What role does the State Department have in coordinating with Russia and China to make sure that we don't impose too many sanctions blocking the Iranians from obtaining, not the Iranian government, but the Iranian people from obtaining the tools they need to achieve their desired goal? In my opinion, it's important. So.
Well, I mean, the issue you raise is a good one. Obviously, there are countries that feel differently about the value of freedom of information than the United States, and we have a very complex and important relationship with both the countries you mentioned, China and Russia. We hope that they take into account the views that we share with them on free communication. However, we recognize that they have their own national interests. We do feel like, however, that the population in Iran deserves to have the opportunity to communicate with the outside world. And what the State Department does is we keep a dialogue open with the people who agree with that. But again, the relationship we have with China and Russia is very complex, and they have a different attitude towards the value of free expression and free communication inside their countries and inside other countries.
They don't have the best record themselves for allowing their people to express their ideas.
Folks have viewed it that way, yes.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask a question. First of all, the bill is amazing, and I wish it can be something add to it. It's good for the Iranian people to can see VOA, but we should add something. It's good VOA have some good material to send to the Iranian people. But it's not a bad idea to have a watchdog system for this organization too. But I want to ask a question from the State Department. In my understanding, it's a lot of wrong information going to the policymakers right now, especially to the State Department. For example, there was this year, April 1st, it's the Sizdabeda for Iranian. It's the cultural big event for us, and we had 12,000 Iranian in Virginia, and that was the biggest gathering ever and for Sizdabeda. And totally that was ignored by the State Department and by the Voice of America and by all the medias. And we had another event, the other side in Maryland, that was maybe 200 people, and there was a campaign for the president in the middle of that. And they posted the picture and a lot of things from that event to the State Department's website, the weblog about with a lot of pictures. And think about the 12,000 Iranian American with all the flag, lion and sun, and our logo, the Farah, and they ignored all these people, and to show that 200 people for some reason, because those their friends, the circle of reformists in Washington D.C., they have super close tie to the officials in State Departments, and they are trying to just protect their connections and don't let the other people come close to these connections at the state. And you mentioned Parasite. I want to say something. Parasite was amazing. I love this program. But do you know it doesn't exist for last 7 months? It doesn't exist, and still the director of VOA, David Enzor, and Steve Reddish, they are going around and they are saying, we have the best program ever, it's called Parasite, but it doesn't exist for last 7 months. Why these wrong information going around this town?
I'm going to begin that, but I'm going to begin by saying I'm really thrilled to say I am no longer working for the State Department. So I'm going to turn over to Ramin for the bulk of that question. I mean, I'm not against the State Department, but you can't hold me responsible. But I can answer some of this. No, I was, to be honest, I was a political appointee by President Clinton. So I was an ambassador for 3 years, and during those 3 years, I discovered something that is very relevant to your question. I came, we have this system where you appoint people from private life to be ambassador. I was previously a professor of art history at Georgetown and specialized in 17th century Dutch art and wrote books and did things on that. So I came to the position with an appreciation of the importance of culture as a component of diplomacy. I discovered two things. One, that is true, that culture can be and is, in fact, a very important part in the relationships between countries and people. And number two, the State Department doesn't pay much attention to that. Ramin is a happy exception to that, but in general, culture is not taken seriously. So there may be some deep conspiracy, there may be just plain laziness, which is often true. You go to the people you know, or it can, the lack of attention paid to this extraordinary cultural event in Virginia, which I know about, can also just be a reflection of a larger attitude in the State Department that, well, it's just a cultural thing. Who cares if there are 12 million people? What importance could it possibly have? Which is obviously a mistake, so maybe this comment will make enough people mad enough that someone will cover it this year. Regarding Parasite, I do want to clarify that is, again, not some conspiracy of the U.S. government. Again, I don't work for VOA either, but I know the co-creators of Parasite, and that is actually just a completely non-government related issue. And there is a real desire to recreate something very much like Parasite, and our Bobby is working on that right now, and very soon you will see something very much like it. It has nothing to do with VOA. So they're very proud of it, and they're going to be airing something very much like it very soon. Don't shake your head, it's true. I'm not kidding, and it's just, well, okay, well, I do too, so we can talk afterwards.
Ramin, you wanted to comment? Or? Yeah. and this is the last comment because we're out of time, but please, Ramin.
I thought the red light meant we were out of time. So, look, the State Department, I hardly want to speak for the State Department here on the whole expanse of this issue. One thing that has developed is that the State Department has taken into consideration, as have others, the fact that there are diaspora groups that are Americans who have something to contribute to the discussion on important issues that affect foreign affairs. One of them is one of the co-hosts of this gathering today. Others gather and have events and so on in diaspora communities throughout this country. And I think that, contrary to what we've heard, that is actually something that the State Department is very interested in doing, is to reaching out to these diaspora populations and having interaction with them, whether it's being done in the most systematic fashion possible is a reasonable point, but to keep in mind, I was allowed to participate in this gathering, and again, this is a gathering of folks who care about an issue on the Hill, as well as some commentators such as myself, but also an Iranian American organization, a diaspora organization. There are diaspora organizations that make up large population, represent large parts of this country's population. And for the first time, I think, the foreign affairs community of the government has recognized the value of diaspora organizations as contributing to a discussion of what's going on in the rest of the world overseas. So I would say just in that, that is an ongoing dialogue that started in a little bit of a different direction than some of the other things that perhaps had taken place before. So I think there's some promise there. Let's keep that going, and we can follow up as we move along.
On behalf of PAAIA, I would like to personally thank, again, Congressman Ed Royce, Congressman Connolly, for allowing us to have this panel in Congress today. And I would like to personally thank Ambassador Schneider, Ramin, and Jodi for participating on this panel. Thank you for attending.